Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
You've probably heard it a million times, right? Cut back on sugar, especially if you're thinking about health, trying to avoid things like type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, it's become almost like common knowledge, hasn't it? Health gospel, as you said.
Exactly. But what if that simple message, while, important, is actually missing a really crucial detail?
Like maybe it's not just about the total amount of sugar we eat.
Precisely. What if it's much more about where that sugar comes from in our diet?
Okay. And that nuance is actually what some massive new research is digging into. It's kind of challenging that simple all sugar is bad idea and adding some, well, surprising layers.
Okay, let's get into this then. For this deep dive, we're looking at these very recent findings. Specifically, a really large systematic review and meta-analysis.
Right, it was just published in the journal Advances in Nutrition.
So our plan is to really unpack what this study tells us. It involved, over 500,000 people?
Yeah, over 500,000 people from different continents, North and South America, Europe, Asia, Australia. It's huge.
And we want to explore what this huge data set suggests about different sources of sugar and their link, if any, to developing type 2 diabetes.
And to do that, we've looked at both a health news article discussing the findings, and importantly, we went straight to the actual scientific paper itself.
Good. So before we jump into the results, which sound pretty eye-opening, maybe we should quickly explain why this kind of study is considered so significant. It's not just a single experiment.
No, exactly. It's a systematic review and a meta-analysis. You can think of it like this. Researchers gather all the relevant high-quality studies already done on a specific question, and then they statistically combine the data from all those studies. The idea is to see if, when you put everything together, bigger, clearer patterns emerge that maybe weren't obvious in the individual smaller studies.
Right, more power in numbers.
Definitely. And in this case, they focus specifically on prospective cohort studies.
Okay, what are those exactly?
Those are studies where they recruit a large group of people, measure things about their habits like diet at the beginning, and then follow them for usually many years.
To see who eventually develops a certain health condition.
Correct. In this case, type 2 diabetes.
And you mentioned the scale over 500,000 people. That really does sound like the most comprehensive look we've had at this specific question. Different sugar sources and diabetes risk.
Absolutely. And their method was quite detailed, too. They didn't just lump all sugar together.
How did it break it down?
Well, they looked at total sugar, so all sugars, natural and added, then added sugar specifically, the sugars and syrups put into foods during processing or cooking.
Yeah.
Also sucrose, which is basically table sugar, and fructose.
Okay, standard categories.
But, and this seems to be the really crucial part, they specifically separated out sugar delivered in liquids.
So drinks.
Yes. Sugar-sweetened beverages, that's your sodas, energy drinks, sports drinks, and also fruit juice. And that included 100% fruit juice, nectars, and other juice drinks.
And they were looking for these dose-response relationships, you said.
Exactly. They wanted to know, essentially, if you consume more of a specific type of sugar source, does your risk of type 2 diabetes go up or down in a predictable way? Like, what's the impact of one daily serving versus 2 versus 3?
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's get to the findings. Because based on that simple sugar is bad message, you hinted this study had some surprises.
Yeah, it really did. The main takeaway, the big headline, was pretty stark. It seems that sugar consumed in beverages is much more strongly linked to type 2 diabetes risk than sugar consumed as part of solid food.
Wow, okay. Let's focus on the drinks first then, because you said that link was strong.
Incredibly strong, particularly for the sugar-sweetened beverages, the SSBs. The analysis found that for every extra 12-ounce serving someone consumed per day, think 1 can of soda or 1 typical energy drink, their risk of developing type 2 diabetes went up by a significant 25%.
25% for just 1 extra drink a day. That's substantial.
It is. And what's really quite concerning is that the data suggested this increased risk kicked in right from the very first daily serving. There didn't seem to be any kind of safe minimum threshold below 1 serving where the risk wasn't elevated.
So even 1 a day is associated with that higher risk.
According to this analysis, yes. Now, It's important context. This is a relative risk increase.
Right. So if my baseline risk is, say, 10%.
Exactly. One soda a day doesn't automatically make your risk 35%, but it increases your existing 10% risk by 25% of that value. So it bumps it up, and obviously the more you drink, the more that relative risk adds up on top of your baseline.
Okay, got it. And it wasn't just sodas and energy drinks, right? You mentioned fruit juice, too.
Yes, they looked at fruit juice separately again, 100% juice, nectars, juice drinks, and they found a link there too, for each additional 8-ounce serving of fruit juice per day.
A stand of glass.
Right. The risk of type 2 diabetes increased by 5%. Now, that's obviously lower than the 25% for SSBs, but it's still a noticeable, statistically significant association specifically for liquid sugar coming from juice.
So both types of sugary drinks showed a link to increased risk, just stronger for the sodas and energy drinks.
That's what this meta-analysis found. But now, here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, a bit counterintuitive compared to the usual advice.
Okay.
When the researchers looked at sugar consumed in solid form, specifically total sugar intake and sucrose intake from food sources, they actually found an inverse association with type 2 diabetes risk.
Hold on, invert? You mean higher intake was linked to lower risk?
I know, it sounds completely backwards, doesn't it? But pooling the data from all these prospective studies, that's the pattern that emerged.
How much lower? What were the numbers?
Specifically, they reported that a 20-gram per day increase in total sugar intake was associated with a 4% reduction in risk, and a 20-gram per day increase in sucrose intake was associated with a 5% reduction in risk.
That is unexpected, to say the least. What about other types of sugar, like added sugars or fructose, when they weren't in drinks?
For those categories, added sugar and fructose consumed outside of beverages, the study found no clear association with type 2 diabetes risk, either positive or negative.
So let me recap this because it's a lot. Liquid sugar, bad link to higher risk. Total sugar and sucrose in food, potentially good link to slightly lower risk. And other added fructose sugars in food, neutral, no clear link.
That's basically the pattern this large analysis points towards. It definitely complicates the simple cut-all-sugar message we often hear.
Okay, there has to be a reason why there's such a huge difference. How do the researchers explain this? Especially that inverse link for sugar in solid food.
Right. They propose it really comes down to the delivery system, the form the sugar takes, and what else comes with it.
Okay.
So with sugar-sweetened drinks and fruit juice, you're essentially getting isolated sugars dissolved in liquid. Your body absorbs these incredibly quickly.
Like a sugar rush straight into the bloodstream.
Exactly. A rapid flood, as you put it. This causes a much bigger, faster spike in your blood glucose levels, what we call a greater glycemic impact.
And that's bad.
Because that sudden surge can overwhelm your liver's ability to process all that sugar at once. This can lead, potentially, to more fat being stored in the liver, and over time, it's thought to contribute to insulin resistance.
Which is a major step towards type 2 diabetes.
Precisely. So it's not just the sugar itself, but the speed and the intensity of its arrival when it's in liquid form.
Okay, that makes sense for the drinks. So how does that compare to sugar in solid food?
Well, think about sugar that's naturally present in, say, whole fruit or dairy or whole grains, or even sugar that's added to these kinds of nutrient-dense solid foods.
It's mixed in with other stuff.
Exactly. It's
Right.
embedded in a matrix with things like fiber, fats, and proteins.
Ah, the accompanying nutrients.
Yes. And these act like natural brakes in your digestive system. They significantly slow down how quickly the sugar is broken down and absorbed into your bloodstream.
So no sudden spike.
Much less of one. You get a slower, gentler rise in blood glucose. It doesn't slam the liver with that overwhelming rush, and therefore, it doesn't seem to trigger the same kind of metabolic stress that can lead towards insulin resistance.
So this explains why even something like whole fruit, which does contain natural sugars, is processed so differently by the body compared to, say, fruit juice made from the same fruit.
That's the core idea. The researchers specifically point this out. Even 100% fruit juice, while it might have some vitamins, is metabolically very different from eating the whole fruit.
Because the juice concentrates the sugar and removes the fiber.
Correct. And that fiber is absolutely crucial for slowing down sugar absorption and supporting better blood glucose control. The juice just gives you the rapidly absorbed sugars without that beneficial fiber matrix.
This really does shift the perspective, doesn't it? It's less about sugar as a single villain and more about the context. What did the study authors say about what this means for, like, dietary advice?
Well, the lead author, Karen Delacorte, she's a nutritional science professor at Brigham Young University. She was quite clear about the implications.
What did she say?
She highlighted that the findings, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, really underscore the need for potentially even stricter recommendations specifically for liquid sugars, things like sodas and fruit juice, because they seem to have this harmful association with metabolic health.
So doubling down on the advice to cut back on sugary drinks.
Yes. But interestingly, she also suggested that maybe future dietary guidelines should move beyond just condemning all added sugars equally.
How so?
She proposed that guidelines might need to consider the different effects sugar has depending on its source liquid versus solid in its form, meaning whether it's consumed with fiber and other nutrients.
That feels like a much more nuanced approach than just a single limit sugar target.
It absolutely is. It suggests our understanding needs to evolve beyond just counting total grams and really look at how we're consuming that sugar.
Okay. Now, it's always important with any study, especially one with such surprising findings, to talk about the strengths and weaknesses. What makes this study reliable, and what are the caveats?
Good point. On the plus side, the main strength is its sheer size, over 500,000 participants, gives it enormous statistical power to detect patterns.
Right.
Also, the fact that it's a meta-analysis, combining results from many prospective cohort studies, adds to its robustness. They specifically looked for those dose-response relationships, which is helpful, and including diverse populations from around the world is another plus.
Okay. Sounds solid. What about the limitations, things we need to keep in mind?
The big one, inherent to this type of research, is that these are observational studies. They track people over time. They can show very strong associations, like the link between liquid sugar and diabetes risk, but they can't definitively prove causation.
The old correlation isn't causation issue.
Exactly. There's always the possibility of what's called residual confounding, meaning even though the researchers try very hard to statistically adjust for known factors that influence diabetes risk, like smoking, exercise, overall diet quality, there might be other unmeasured lifestyle differences between people who drink lots of sugary drinks and those who don't, and those differences could be contributing to the risk, not just the drinks themselves.
Okay, that's a fair caution. Anything else?
Well, getting perfectly accurate dietary information from people reporting their own intake over many years is always challenging. There can be inaccuracies.
Sure.
And the researchers noted that the definitions for certain sugar types, like fructose, weren't perfectly consistent across all the original studies they included, which could add a little bit of statistical noise.
Makes sense.
And importantly, they did assign a lower level of certainty to some of the findings, particularly that inverse association, the potentially protective effect seen for total sugar and sucrose from solid foods. While that pattern was there in the combined data, the evidence for it isn't considered quite as strong or certain as the evidence linking liquid sugars to increased risks.
Okay, so the link between drinks and higher risk seems more robust than the link between solid food sugars and lower risk.
That seems to be the assessment, yes.
All right. So bringing this all together for you, the listener, listening right now, what's the main takeaway? If you want one practical thing from this deep dive, what should it be?
I think based on this really comprehensive analysis, the clearest, most consistent message is about being particularly mindful of the sugar you get from liquids.
So sodas, energy drinks, sports drinks.
And fruit juice, too. That category seems to be where the strongest, most direct link to increased type 2 diabetes risk lies, according to this huge data set.
And that's in pretty stark contrast to sugar that's naturally part of, or maybe even added to, solid foods that are also nutrient-dense, where this study found either no clear link, or possibly even that slight inverse, potentially protective association for total sugar and sucrose.
Right. It really does encourage us to maybe shift our focus a bit. Instead of just looking at the total grams of sugar on a nutrition label for everything, perhaps think more critically about the form it's in. Is it liquid and isolated, or is it part of a solid food matrix with fiber and other nutrients?
That feels like a really useful distinction to make in everyday life. So maybe a final thought to leave people with, based on this deep dive, could rethinking your beverage choices, maybe swapping sugary drinks or even juice for water or unsweetened tea or choosing the whole fruit instead of the juice, could that be a more impactful first step for your metabolic health than trying to track every single gram of sugar across your whole diet?
It's definitely something this research prompts us to consider, isn't it? How much does the source of the sugar matter in the grand scheme of things? Makes you think.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.